The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Millbrook County Courthouse, where Sarah Johnson sat quietly on the wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. At 42 years old, she was used to being early for everything, a habit that had helped her build her successful small business, Sweet Delights Bakery, over the past 15 years. Sarah checked her watch again. 9:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, she would face Judge Richard Harrison for what should have been a simple parking violation. Around her, the courthouse buzzed with the usual morning activity. Police officers escorted defendants, lawyers hurried past with briefcases, and court clerks shuffled papers from room to room. Case number 247, Sarah Johnson, the court clerk called out, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah stood up, smoothing her navy blue business suit, the same one she wore to important meetings with clients. As she walked toward the front of the courtroom, she could feel Judge Harrison's stern gaze following her every move. At 65, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Harrison had served on the bench for over 2 decades, earning a reputation for being strict but fair, at least according to some. Ms. Johnson, Judge Harrison began, looking down at her from his elevated position. His voice carried a hint of irritation that seemed out of place for a simple parking ticket. You're here for parking violation number P 2024-113, correct? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah replied calmly, standing straight with her shoulders back. She had prepared her explanation carefully. According to this citation, you parked your vehicle in a metered space for 3 hours without paying. How do you play it? Sarah cleared her throat softly. Your Honor, I'd like to explain. I did attempt to pay the meter, but it was malfunctioning. I even took a video showing that it wouldn't accept any coins or cards. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. And did you report this malfunction to parking enforcement? Yes, sir. I called the number listed on the meter immediately and left a message. I also had an emergency meeting with a client about their wedding cake, and the only available parking spot was... Ms. Johnson, Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp. The court is not interested in your business appointments. A broken meter is not an excuse to park without payment. You should have found another spot. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm, but she maintained her composure. Your Honor, the closest alternative parking was 6 blocks away, and I had to transport delicate cake samples. I made every effort to follow proper procedures. The judge shuffled some papers on his desk, barely glancing at them. Several other people in the courtroom watched the exchange with growing interest. A young law clerk in the corner frowned slightly, looking uncomfortable with the judge's tone. Ms. Johnson, this court sees dozens of parking violations every week. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone has an emergency. Judge Harrison's voice carried a condescending tone that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Your previous record shows 2 other parking violations in the past year. Those were dismissed, Your Honor, when I provided evidence. Nevertheless, he cut her off again. It shows a pattern of disregard for our city's parking regulations. He paused, looking down at her over his glasses. This court hereby fines you $500 to be paid within 30 days. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the court clerk looked up in surprise. Parking fines rarely exceeded $100. $500? Sarah repeated, struggling to keep her voice steady. Your Honor, that seems excessive for a parking violation, especially given the circumstances. Would you like to make it 700, Ms. Johnson? Judge Harrison asked coldly. This court will not tolerate arguments or excuses. You may pay the fine at the clerk's office. Next case. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Behind her, she could hear whispers from the spectators. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of a young white woman being called up for the same violation. She paused briefly at the back of the courtroom, watching as Judge Harrison addressed the other defendant with notably more patience and courtesy. Walking out into the bright morning sunlight, Sarah pulled out her phone. With fingers still shaking slightly, she scrolled to her sister's number. Patricia Johnson, mayor of Millbrook. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore, and Sarah knew her sister needed to hear about what had just happened in that courtroom. Mayor Patricia Johnson sat in her office at City Hall, reviewing budget proposals for the upcoming fiscal year. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, highlighting the many awards and certificates that decorated her walls. testimonies to her 6 years of dedicated service to Millbrook. At 45, she was the city's first black female mayor, a position she had earned through years of community service and hard work. The sharp ring of her phone cut through the quiet office. Seeing her sister's name on the screen, Patricia smiled, but that smile quickly faded as she heard Sarah's shaky voice. "Pat, you won't believe what just happened in Judge Harrison's courtroom," Sarah began, her usually confident voice trembling slightly. Patricia leaned back in her leather chair, listening intently as Sarah described the morning's events. Her grip on the phone tightened as her sister detailed Judge Harrison's dismissive attitude and the excessive fine. Years of political experience had taught Patricia to control her expressions, but now, alone in her office, she allowed her face to show the anger she felt building inside. $500 for a parking ticket, Patricia repeated, standing up to pace her office. "And you said you have video evidence of the broken meter?" "Yes, it's right here on my phone," Sarah replied. "But you wouldn't even look at it. Pat, you should have seen how he treated the white woman after me. He was like a different person, all smiles and understanding." Patricia stopped at her office window, looking out over the city she had sworn to serve and protect. Below, people went about their daily business, unaware of the small injustices that still plagued their community. She thought about her own journey, the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination she had faced on her path to becoming mayor. "Send me the video," Patricia said firmly, "and forward me any emails or messages you sent about reporting the broken meter. I'm not handling this as your sister. I'm handling this as the mayor who needs to ensure our justice system treats everyone fairly." Just then, Patricia's assistant, Pam, knocked on her door with the afternoon schedule of meetings. She quickly jotted down Sarah's case number and the details of what happened. "Sarah, I have to go into a council meeting now, but this isn't over," Patricia assured her sister. "Judge Harrison might not know we're related, but he's about to learn that every citizen in Millbrook deserves respect and fair treatment." After hanging up, Patricia sat at her desk and began typing notes into her computer. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she documented everything Sarah had told her. Years of dealing with city politics had taught her the importance of keeping detailed records. During her next break between meetings, Patricia quietly called the court clerk's office, requesting statistics on Judge Harrison's recent cases. She was careful not to mention her sister or her position as mayor. This needed to be handled properly, through official channels. That evening, as Patricia drove home, she took a detour past the parking meter where Sarah had received her ticket. Sure enough, there was now an out-of-order sign taped to it. She pulled over and took a picture with her phone, adding it to her growing file of evidence. At home, Patricia sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, spreading out her notes and documents. Her husband, Michael, watched her with concern. "You got that look?" he said, sitting down beside her. "The one you get when you're planning something big." "It's not just about Sarah," Patricia explained, showing him the initial data she'd received from the clerk's office. "Look at these numbers. The fines for minority defendants are consistently higher than those for white defendants in Harrison's court. This has been going on for months, maybe years." Michael examined the papers, his frown deepening. "You need to be careful, Pat. Harrison has powerful friends in this town." Patricia nodded, but her jaw was set with determination. "So do I, Michael. So do I. And it's time we shed some light on what's happening in that courtroom." As she prepared for bed that night, Patricia's phone lit up with a text from Sarah. "Thank you for listening, sis. I was afraid I was overreacting." Patricia typed back quickly. "You aren't overreacting. Rest easy. Your big sister's got this." Setting her alarm for an early start, Patricia began mentally preparing for the battle ahead. Tomorrow, she would start gathering more evidence, but she would have to move carefully. As both a mayor and a sister, she knew the importance of handling this situation with both justice and wisdom. Over the next week, Mayor Patricia Johnson's office became a quiet center of investigation. She had transformed one corner of her private office into a research station with stacks of court records spread across a side table. Her assistant, Tom, had been sworn to secrecy about their special project. "Mayor Johnson," Tom said, entering her office with another stack of papers early Monday morning. "I got the last 6 months of Judge Harrison's court records, just like you asked." Patricia looked up from her computer, where she had been creating a spreadsheet of cases. Dark circles under her eyes showed she had been working late into the night. "Thank you, Tom. Did anyone ask why we needed these?" "No, ma'am. I told them it was for the annual judicial review, just like you suggested." Tom placed the files carefully on her desk. Patricia smiled. Tom had proven to be incredibly reliable since she started this investigation. She picked up the first file and began examining it, adding more numbers to her growing database. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing day. In traffic violations alone, Judge Harrison's fines for black defendants averaged 70% higher than those for white defendants. For similar parking violations, white defendants were more likely to receive warnings, while minorities almost always received the maximum fine. Around noon, Patricia received an unexpected visit from Marcus Thompson, a retired court clerk who had worked with Judge Harrison for 15 years. He had heard through the grapevine about her interest in the judge's records. "Mayor Johnson," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I've been wanting to come forward about this for years." His hands shook slightly as he placed his own notebook on her desk. "I kept private records of what I saw in that courtroom." Patricia leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What made you keep these records, Mr. Thompson? When you see the same thing happen day after day, year after year, you start to notice patterns," Marcus explained, opening his notebook. "Judge Harrison, he's clever about it. Never obvious enough to raise immediate red flags, but the numbers don't lie." For the next hour, Marcus shared his observations with Patricia. His detailed notes included specific cases, dates, and even conversations he had overheard in the judge's chambers. Patricia recorded everything, her spreadsheet growing more damning with each entry. Later that afternoon, Patricia visited the parking enforcement office. The supervisor, Janet Mills, pulled up the maintenance records for the meter where Sarah had received her ticket. "Here it is," Janet said, pointing to her computer screen. "3 complaints about that meter in the week before your sister's ticket. We even had a work order pending." She looked up at Patricia. "Mayor Johnson, if you're building a case, you should know that's not the only problem we've seen." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Janet pulled out more records, showing how parking enforcement officers have been instructed to monitor certain areas more heavily than others, areas that happen to be predominantly minority neighborhoods. By evening, Patricia's investigation had expanded beyond just her sister's case. She now had evidence of systematic bias across multiple levels of the local justice system. As she reviewed her findings with Michael over dinner at home, her phone buzzed with a text from another victim of Judge Harrison's bias. "Look at this," she said, showing Michael the message. "A young black college student was fined $400 for jaywalking last month. The same day, Judge Harrison dismissed an identical charge against a white student." Michael shook his head. "The question is, what are you going to do with all this information?" Patricia stood up and walked to their home office, returning with a thick folder. "I'm preparing a comprehensive report for the City Council and the State Judicial Review Board. But we need to handle this carefully. One wrong move, and Harrison's friends could bury the whole investigation." She spent the rest of the evening organizing her evidence, creating clear charts and graphs that showed the disparity in sentencing. The numbers were undeniable. In case after case, Judge Harrison's bias was revealed through his own court records. As midnight approached, Patricia received one final piece of evidence, an email from a former courthouse employee with audio recordings of Judge Harrison making questionable comments in his chambers. She added this to her growing file, knowing that tomorrow would bring the next crucial phase of her plan. "Just wait, Sarah," she whispered to herself as she finally prepared for bed. "Justice is coming, and it's bringing receipts." The monthly City Council meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. in the Grand Chamber of Millbrook City Hall. Judge Richard Harrison sat in his usual front row seat, looking confident in his expensive gray suit. He had attended these meetings for years, usually spending most of his time checking emails on his phone while others spoke. Mayor Patricia Johnson arrived exactly 5 minutes before the meeting, carrying a thick blue folder. Several council members noticed her serious expression, quite different from her usual warm smile. Her assistant, Tom, followed behind, pushing a cart with a projector and laptop. "Good evening, everyone," Patricia began precisely at 7:00 p.m., her voice clear and strong. Before we begin our regular agenda, I need to address an urgent matter concerning our local justice system. Judge Harrison looked up from his phone, mild curiosity crossing his face. He had no idea that the mayor had any connection to Sarah Johnson. After all, they had different last names due to Sarah's marriage. Over the past month, Patricia continued, nodding to Tom, who started the projector, my office has conducted a thorough review of our local court proceedings. The first slide appeared on the screen, showing a graph of fine amounts based on defendant's race. Judge Harrison's expression changed slightly as he began to understand the direction of this presentation. He sat up straighter, his phone forgotten in his hand. These statistics show a disturbing pattern, Patricia said, her voice remaining professional despite the anger she felt inside. For identical violations, minority defendants consistently receive fines that are 50 to 70% higher than those given to white defendants. Murmurs filled the chamber. Council members leaned forward in their seats, some taking notes, others whispering to each other. Judge Harrison's face had grown noticeably pale. Let's look at a specific recent case, Patricia continued, clicking to the next slide. Last week, a respected local business owner received a $500 fine for a parking violation at a meter that was documented as malfunctioning. Judge Harrison's eyes widened as he recognized the case. Patricia noticed his reaction but continued speaking. Just 30 minutes later, another defendant with the exact same violation received only a warning. The difference? The first defendant was black, the second was white. Patricia paused, letting her words sink in. The first defendant was my sister, Sarah Johnson. The room fell completely silent. Judge Harrison's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He finally realized who Sarah was, and more importantly, who her sister was. Your Honor, Patricia said, turning directly to face Judge Harrison, would you care to explain this disparity? Judge Harrison stood up, straightening his tie. Mayor Johnson, these statistics can be misleading without proper context. Each case is unique. Indeed, they are, Patricia interrupted, clicking to the next slide. Which is why we also reviewed audio recordings, witness statements, and 15 years of court records provided by former court clerk Marcus Thompson. She gestured to Marcus, who stood up from his seat in the back of the room. Judge Harrison's face turned from pale to slightly green as he recognized his former employee. The evidence shows this isn't about unique cases, Patricia continued. It's about systematic bias in our justice system, a system that should protect all citizens equally. One of the council members, an elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, spoke up. Mayor Johnson, what actions do you propose we take? Patricia opened her blue folder. I have here a formal request for a state-level investigation of all cases handled by Judge Harrison over the past 5 years. I'm also proposing immediate reforms to our local judicial oversight system. Judge Harrison finally found his voice. This is outrageous. You can't. I can and I must, Patricia stated firmly. As mayor, it's my duty to ensure justice is served fairly in our city. As a sister, I've seen firsthand how bias affects our community, and as a public servant, I'm bound by oath to address these issues. The chamber erupted in discussion. Reporters who had been quietly sitting in the back began furiously taking notes. Judge Harrison sank back into his seat, looking defeated as he realized the gravity of his situation. As the meeting continued, Patricia maintained her professional demeanor, but inside she felt a deep satisfaction. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about every person who had faced unfair treatment in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The confrontation she had carefully planned was just the beginning. Now the real work of reforming Millbrook's justice system would begin. The morning after the city council meeting, Millbrook woke up to explosive headlines. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Daily, ran a front-page story. Justice on trial. Mayor exposes court bias. Below the headline was a split photo. Judge Harrison on one side, Mayor Patricia Johnson on the other. By 8:00 a.m., the story had spread like wildfire across social media. Sarah Johnson's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as more people began sharing their own experiences with Judge Harrison. I can't believe this is finally coming out, said Marcus Williams, a local barber, as he spoke to a TV news crew outside his shop. 2 years ago, Judge Harrison fined me $300 for a broken taillight. My white neighbor got a warning for the same thing the next day. The local coffee shops and diners were buzzing with conversation. At Sweet Delight's Bakery, Sarah's regular customers showed their support by forming longer than usual lines, buying extra pastries, and sharing their own courthouse stories. "Remember when he fined my son $800 for skateboarding in the park?" Mrs. Rodriguez told another customer while waiting in line. "But when the mayor showed those statistics yesterday, Lord, I nearly fell out of my chair." Local radio host James Turner dedicated his entire morning show to the topic. His phone lines were jammed with callers eager to share their experiences. "I'm a court translator," said one caller named Maria. "I've seen Judge Harrison rush through cases with Hispanic defendants, barely letting them explain their situations. But he'd spend 20 minutes chatting with white defendants about golf." By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. People carried handmade signs with messages like "Justice should be colorblind" and "Equal treatment under law." The crowd grew larger as more people joined during their lunch breaks. Inside her office at City Hall, Mayor Patricia Johnson watched the events unfold on multiple screens. Her phone rang constantly with calls from state officials and national news organizations. Even her sister Sarah was being approached for interviews. "Pat, CNN wants to talk to both of us," Sarah said during a quick phone call. "They're sending a crew from Atlanta." Patricia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Just remember, Sarah, stick to the facts. This is bigger than just your case now." Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags like #JudgeHarrisonMustGo and #MillbrookJustice. People from neighboring cities began sharing similar stories about their own court systems, turning a local issue into a regional movement. Judge Harrison, meanwhile, had called in sick to work. Reporters camped outside his large colonial house were met with closed curtains and a no comments sign taped to the front door. By late afternoon, civil rights organizations had gotten involved. The NAACP announced they would conduct their own investigation into Millbrook's court system. Local lawyers began offering free consultations to review cases handled by Judge Harrison. At Sweet Delight's Bakery, Sarah couldn't keep up with the orders. Customers kept coming in, not just for her famous apple pies, but to show support and share their stories. She had to call in extra help just to manage the crowd. "Your sister did an amazing thing," said an elderly black woman, reaching across the counter to squeeze Sarah's hand. 20 years ago, nobody would have dared to challenge a judge like this. As evening approached, a candlelight vigil was organized in the town square. Hundreds of people gathered, holding lights and sharing their experiences with the justice system. The local TV stations broadcast it live. "This isn't just about one judge or one case," a young college student said into a reporter's microphone. "It's about standing up against bias wherever we find it." Back in her office, Patricia watched the coverage on her computer screen, tears in her eyes. What had started as a sister's fight for justice had become a movement for change. Her assistant Tom knocked on the door. "Mayor, the governor's office is on line 1. They want to discuss forming a statewide task force on judicial bias." Patricia took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and reached for the phone. The story that began with a simple parking ticket was now reaching the highest levels of state government. Outside her window, she could see the growing crowd in the town square, the candles twinkling in the gathering darkness. Change was coming to Millbrook, and there would be no going back. 1 week after the explosive city council meeting, Judge Richard Harrison sat alone in his home office, staring at the formal letter from the State Judicial Review Board. The heavy paper felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hands. The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. His phone had been ringing non-stop for days, but he'd stopped answering it. His friends at the country club had suddenly become too busy for their weekly golf games. Even his own daughter, a law student in Boston, had called to express her disappointment. "Dad, how could you?" she had asked, her voice crackling with emotion over the phone. "Everything you taught me about justice and fairness, was it all just words?" Now, sitting in his quiet house, those words haunted him. The wall behind his desk was covered with awards and certificates, 30 years of what he had thought was honorable service. Today, it seemed to mock him. The local newspaper lay open on his desk. The headline read, "State Investigation Reveals Deeper Bias in Harrison's Court." Below was a detailed analysis of over 1,000 cases he had presided over. The numbers were impossible to deny. Minority defendants had consistently received harsher sentences and higher fines. His secretary, Linda, had finally broken her silence yesterday. "Judge Harrison," she had said, dropping a thick folder on his desk. "I've kept copies of every concerning incident I witnessed over the past 5 years." Her hands had trembled, but her voice was firm. "The review board needs to see these." The doorbell rang, startling him from his thoughts. Through the window, he saw reporters gathering again. They had been camping outside his house all week, hoping for a statement. But this time, it wasn't a reporter at the door. It was Marcus Thompson, his former court clerk. "We need to talk," Marcus said when Harrison opened the door. "The review board meets tomorrow, and you need to understand exactly what they have." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus laid out everything. The documented patterns of bias, the recordings of inappropriate comments, the statistical evidence that couldn't be explained away. Harrison's face grew more ashen with each revelation. "I kept hoping you'd realize what you were doing," Marcus said quietly. "I watched you hand down different sentences for the same crimes, day after day. The only difference was the color of the defendant's skin." Harrison slumped in his chair. "I never thought. I didn't consciously." "That's the problem," Marcus interrupted. "You never thought about it. You just acted on your biases without questioning them." Later that evening, Harrison received another visitor, Reverend James Carter from the First Baptist Church. The Reverend had known Harrison for 20 years and had served on several community boards with him. "Richard," the Reverend said, settling into a chair, "I'm here as your friend, but also as someone who has watched members of my congregation suffer in your courtroom." Harrison couldn't meet his eyes. "James, I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything. Listen." The Reverend leaned forward. "Tomorrow, you have a choice. You can defend yourself, make excuses, try to explain away the evidence, or you can take responsibility and commit to real change." As night fell, Harrison sat at his desk again, this time writing his statement for the review board. He crumpled paper after paper, struggling to find the right words. His entire career, his reputation, his legacy, everything hung in the balance. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Dad, whatever you decide tomorrow, remember what you always told me. True justice requires courage and honesty." Harrison looked at the family photo on his desk, then at all his achievements on the wall. Finally, he turned to his computer and began typing his final version. "To the State Judicial Review Board. I come before you today not to defend my actions, but to acknowledge them. The evidence presented by Mayor Johnson and others has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my behavior on the bench." As he typed, the weight of years of biased decisions pressed down on him. Tomorrow would be his reckoning, and for the first time in his career, Judge Richard Harrison prepared to face true justice. The community center's main hall was packed for the first day of mandatory sensitivity training. Judge Richard Harrison sat in the front row, no longer wearing his usual expensive suits but dressed in a simple blue shirt and khakis. Around him sat other court officials, police officers, and city employees, all required to attend as part of Millbrook's new judicial reform program. Dr. Angela Martinez, a renowned expert in racial bias and judicial fairness, stood at the podium. "Change begins with understanding," she said, looking directly at Harrison. "We must first acknowledge our biases before we can overcome them." Harrison found himself taking detailed notes, something he hadn't done since law school. As Dr. Martinez showed examples of unconscious bias in everyday situations, he recognized patterns from his own courtroom decisions. His pen paused over his notebook as memories of past cases flooded his mind. During the lunch break, Harrison sat alone at a corner table, but was surprised when Sarah Johnson approached him with her tray. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. Harrison looked up, startled. "Ms. Johnson, yes, please sit." An uncomfortable silence hung between them as Sarah arranged her lunch. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice quiet. "I've been wanting to apologize to you personally. That parking ticket case, it opened my eyes to something I've been blind to for years." Sarah studied him carefully. "Judge Harrison, I'm not here for just an apology. I'm here because I want to understand. How does someone with your education and position end up making such biased decisions?" For the next hour, They had the most honest conversation of Harrison's life. He talked about his privileged upbringing, his limited exposure to diverse communities, and the unconscious assumptions he carried with him to the bench. "It's like I was wearing glasses with tinted lenses all these years," he explained, "and suddenly someone showed me what the world really looks like without them." Sarah listened intently, occasionally challenging his perspectives but remaining open to dialogue. As they talked, other participants noticed their conversation. Some even joined in, sharing their own experiences with bias from both sides of the justice system. Later that afternoon, during a role-playing exercise, Harrison was asked to play the defendant in a scenario similar to Sarah's case. Standing on the other side of the bench, feeling the anxiety and frustration of being unfairly judged, he felt something shift inside him. "This is what you put people through," his conscience whispered. That evening, Harrison requested a meeting with Mayor Patricia Johnson. In her office, he presented her with a detailed plan he'd been working on. "I want to start a mentoring program," he explained, spreading the papers on her desk. "Using my experience as both a warning and a teaching tool, we can help other judges recognize and address their own biases." Patricia reviewed the proposal, her expression thoughtful. "You're suggesting using your own case as an example?" "Yes," Harrison nodded. "Sometimes the best lessons come from acknowledged mistakes." Over the next few weeks, Harrison threw himself into his transformation. He attended every optional workshop, read books about systemic racism, and spent time in community centers he'd never visited before. He asked Marcus Thompson to help him review his past cases, looking for opportunities to make amends. The local newspaper ran a story about his progress. From bias to bridge building, Judge Harrison's journey. While some remained skeptical, others began to see genuine change. One morning, Harrison arrived at his office to find a fresh-baked pie from Sweet Delights Bakery. The note attached read, "Change is sweet. Keep going, Sarah." During the final day of training, Dr. Martinez asked each participant to share their most important lesson. When Harrison's turn came, he stood slowly. "I learned that justice isn't just about following laws," he said, his voice emotional. "It's about seeing the human being standing before you, really seeing them, without the filters of prejudice or assumption." As he sat down, he noticed Sarah and Patricia Johnson at the back of the room. They both gave him small nods of acknowledgement. That evening, as Harrison packed up his notes from the training, he found an old photo of himself being sworn in as judge 30 years ago. Looking at his younger self, he whispered, "We're finally learning what justice really means." The transformation wasn't complete. He knew it never would be. But for the first time in his career, Judge Richard Harrison was truly serving justice, not just enforcing laws. 6 months after the parking ticket incident that changed Millbrook forever, the city gathered for a special ceremony in front of the courthouse. Bright autumn leaves danced in the breeze as Mayor Patricia Johnson stood at the podium, addressing a crowd that filled the courthouse steps and spilled onto the street. "Today, we celebrate not just new policies, but a new chapter in our city's history," Patricia announced, her voice carrying across the crowd. Behind her sat Sarah Johnson, Judge Harrison, and various city officials on wooden chairs arranged neatly on the courthouse steps. The mayor gestured to a large screen displaying Millbrook's new judicial oversight system. "Every fine, every sentence, and every decision made in our courts is now tracked and reviewed monthly for signs of bias. But numbers are just the beginning." In the front row, Sarah watched her sister with pride. Her bakery, Sweet Delights, had provided refreshments for the ceremony, and she could see people enjoying her famous cookies while they listened. The business had grown significantly since her case went public, becoming a symbol of community solidarity. Judge Harrison, sitting straight in his chair, looked different from the man who had fined Sarah 6 months ago. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by something humbler, more thoughtful. He wore a name tag that read Director of Judicial Education Program under his name. "Our next speaker," Patricia continued, "is someone who has shown us that real change is possible when we have the courage to face our mistakes. Judge Richard Harrison." As Harrison approached the podium, there was a mixture of applause and whispers from the crowd. He adjusted his glasses and pulled out a single note card. "6 months ago, I was part of the problem," he began, his voice steady. "Today, I stand before you as part of the solution. Our new training program has already hosted judges from 12 other cities. helping them identify and address bias in their own courtrooms. The crowd listened intently as Harrison explained how Millbrook's experience had become a model for other communities. The state had adopted many of their reforms, and other states were showing interest. After the speeches, people mingled in the courthouse garden, enjoying Sarah's baked goods and discussing the changes they'd seen. Old Marcus Thompson, the former court clerk who had helped expose the bias, stood with tears in his eyes as he watched young police officers talking with community members. Ms. Johnson, a young black law student, approached Sarah. "Your case inspired me to focus on civil rights law. Would you mind if I interviewed you for my thesis?" Sarah smiled, remembering how a simple parking ticket had sparked such significant change. "Of course," she replied. "But make sure you interview Judge Harrison too. Sometimes the most important stories are about how people can change." Nearby, Patricia was speaking with reporters about the practical results of the reforms. "In just 6 months, we've seen a 95% reduction in discriminatory sentencing. Every defendant now receives a detailed explanation of their rights in their native language, and we have a diverse panel of community members observing court proceedings." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new plaque on the courthouse wall. It read, "Justice sees no color, wealth, or status. Dedicated to equal treatment under law, inspired by the courage of those who stood up for change." As the crowd began to disperse, an unexpected moment occurred. Judge Harrison approached Sarah with a small envelope. "What's this?" Sarah asked, opening it carefully. "A refund check for your parking fine," Harrison replied, with interest. "And something else. I've established a scholarship fund at the local law school in your name. The Sarah Johnson Justice Scholarship will help minority students pursue legal careers." Sarah looked at the check, then at Harrison. "You know, it was never about the money." "I know," he nodded. "It was about dignity, respect, and fairness. Things I finally learned to see clearly." As the sun set behind the courthouse, the Johnson sisters stood together, watching people take photos with the new plaque. "Did you ever imagine a parking ticket would lead to all this?" Sarah asked her sister. Patricia smiled, putting an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. The important thing is being brave enough to stand up when those moments come." In the gathering dusk, the courthouse lights came on, illuminating the building's grand facade. But now it wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of how one person's stand for justice could transform an entire community. The story of the white judge and the black woman would be told in Millbrook for years to come, not as a tale of conflict, but as proof that change is always possible when people are willing to face truth, admit mistakes, and work together for justice.